Post 352, Study Session 3, Soldiers and New States. Introduction. In this study session, I will present to you some explanations on the conditions in which coups are likely to occur and suggesting the underlying features of new state politics, which help to give rise to them. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to explain the general conditions under which military coups are likely to occur and discuss the underlying features of the new state politics that creates room for coups to take place. Military coups and regimes. Military coups and the military regimes which follow from them are so much a feature of third world politics that their presence or absence in any given region might almost be taken as a rough and ready touchstone of third worldliness. Like all political generalizations, this one is subject to exceptions. Within Europe, coups have taken place since 1960. In Greece and Portugal, both of which may count among the more third worldly of European states, and the installation of a military government in Poland in December 1981, demonstrated that the army cannot always be insulated from a direct political role, even in Marxist-Leninist states. The difference between industrial states, either capitalist or communist, and the third world is nonetheless striking. Fully 3/4 of the 20 Latin American regimes have had military coups since 1960, the only exception being the socialist states of Cuba, the peculiar family dictatorship of Haiti, and 3 countries, Mexico, Costa Rica, and Venezuela, which appear to have achieved a stable balance of civilian political forces. Just on half the states in Third World Asia, and rather more in Africa, have had military coups and governments over the same period, even though since many states did not become independent until after 1960. These have been less at risk. Within each continent, there have been regions in which military interventions have so far been very limited or non-existent, leaving an increased incidence of coups in other regions. None of the 8 African states south of the line, from Angola through Zambia and Malawi to Mozambique, has yet experienced a successful coup. Perhaps because of the delayed independence of the former Portuguese colonies and Zimbabwe, in part because the South African presence may inhibit coups in the 3 former High Commission territories. In Asia, the traditionally states of the Arabian Peninsula provide the largest coup-free zone, though the constitutionalist regimes of India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and Singapore have also maintained civilian control over the army. In general, and especially in Africa, the absence of military government reflects the skills and good fortune of a civilian political leader, rather than anything inherently inconducive to military intervention in the state which he governs. The successful coups in Liberia in 1980 and Guinea in 1984, and the unsuccessful ones in the Gambia in 1981 and Kenya in 1982, all indicate the vulnerability of regimes which have been regarded as among the most stable in Africa. In some cases, such as the Francophone African states of Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Gabon, coups may be inhibited as much as anything by the support which the regime receives from an external power. The only substantial area of the Third World which has as yet had no military governments is the English-speaking Caribbean, many of the states in which have only recently become independent. Even here, there has been 1 military coup in Grenada, and the army has had to be disbanded in Dominica. The incidence of coups has called forth numerous attempts at explanation, which between them have run the full range of social science theorizing. Some have sought statistical correlation between those states in which coups have and have not taken place, while others have taken a general conceptual approach, backed by citing particular examples. Some have looked for explanations at a global level, some with reference to given continents and regions, and some by examining the circumstances of individual states. These have gone a long way towards explaining the conditions in which coups are likely to occur and suggesting the underlying features of third world politics, which help to give rise to them. Economic dependence, for example, is clearly related to political instability through the existence of a significant but not universal correlation between coups and rapid drops in the value of exported primary products. Of greater direct concern for this study session, which in any event is not concerned with the appraisal of the enormous literature in this field, are the studies which seek to link military intervention to general underlying features of the politics of third world states. Notably, Finner's concept of political culture and Huntington's concept of institutionalized and its converse Praetorianism. The idea of political culture is an elusive and in many ways an unsatisfactory one, but fundamentally it is linked, as Finner uses it, to the notion of legitimacy. A society with a developed political culture is one in which there is a broadly held belief in a certain kind of political structure, in which leaders are selected according to a given procedure or exercise, power in accordance with given standards as to what is legitimate or right. This structure may be a liberal democratic or Marxist-Leninist or traditional religious one, but it must give an element of moral backing to a regime which cannot be supplied by simple force. One way in which this is significant is that a high proportion of third world states which have not seriously been treated by coups have been those in which some such sense of legitimacy can be discerned. Liberal democratic in Sri Lanka or Jamaica, Marxist-Leninist in Cuba or Vietnam, traditional in Nepal or Saudi Arabia. Not that this legitimacy can be relied on to preserve these regimes for all time. Legitimacy itself lays down standards which must be respected if it is to survive, and traditional and liberal democratic values are especially vulnerable. A second way in which it is significant is that a high proportion of third world states are artificial and subject to rapid and disruptive change, both of which make it extremely difficult to generate widely accepted political values. Military intervention then takes place because there is no moral constraint which prevents it. Huntington's emphasis is on political organization rather than political values. An institutionalized society is one in which there are effective political mechanisms for reconciling and implementing demands, the most appropriate of which are political parties. Political parties or equivalent institutions will certainly prevent many kinds of demands from being presented at all. Indeed, one of the ways in which they most effectively maintain order is by keeping things off the political agenda. It is essential, however, that they should be what Huntington terms autonomous, that they should not simply act as the mouthpieces of particular sections of the society, such as ethnic, religious, or class groups. Implicit in this is some conception of a national or public interest, overriding sectional interest, and this in turn takes one back to some notion of shared values. By the same token, shared values are unlikely to survive for very long unless there is some institutional mechanism in which they are embodied. A Praetorian society is one in which there are no effective institutions, and in which social groups take direct political actions to achieve their goals. A free-all, in which the army is likely to be most successful because it largely controls the instrument of force. The incidence of military takeover can thus be seen as following either from the polarization of third world states on ethnic lines, resulting in army intervention on behalf of one ethnic group, or to impose order on all of them, or else from the decay of political parties and imposition of personal rule, which often characterize the post-independence period. Both Finner's and Huntington's approach may be modified by, but are not essentially at odds with the neo-patrimonial structure of third world politics already suggested. The absence of effective political institutions, in Huntington's sense, need not directly lead to a Praetorian clash of social forces, because political demands may instead be mediated through personal leadership and patron-client networks. Such networks are, however, unable to serve the functions which Huntington requires of institutions, precisely because, being essentially private in nature, they cannot generate a sense of legitimacy. Within a neo-patrimonial system, there is nothing much to distinguish a leader who owns his position to a military coup from one who owns it to an election. The essential basis for his power is in either case that he has power and can use that power to make deals with those people and groups whose support he needs. This is the main reason why for many purposes it may not matter at all that much whether a regime is civilian or military, or why it often becomes rather difficult to distinguish the two. There is, however, a more basic reason for the salience of the military in third world politics than either Fina or Huntington suggest, and this arises from the centrality of the state. In countries where the state is itself by far the dominant source of organized power, control of the state by any agency external to it becomes extremely difficult, and a military coup represents the ultimate refinement on the process by which the state is taken over by its own servants. Sometimes, indeed, a coup can be seen as a result of actions by the incumbent government which threaten the interests of self-image of the bureaucracy. The Ghanaian coup of January 1972, for example, followed hard on the government austerity measures which cut housing and motor car allowances for senior civil servants, including army officers, and through a drastic devaluation of the currency, threatened their access to the imported consumer goods on which an elite lifestyle depended. More often, intervention is occasioned, or at any rate justified, by reference to more general political goals or ideals, such as incapacity, dishonesty, or ethnic favoritism. Of the regime. Military regime. The early beliefs that military regimes in Black Africa were inherently neo-colonial in origin and policy, given some coloring by the 1966 coup against Nkrumah in Ghana, has proved unable to survive the belligerent nationalism of the Nigerian military government after 1975, or the messianic populism of the regimes led by the Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings in Ghana's politicians. Seen as devious, dishonest, factionalist, self-seeking players of sterile games, which can only harm the country, and beyond this, it is not difficult to see a distaste for the whole political way of doing things, for bargaining, negotiation, manipulation, and more generally for political organization. Such a simple set of attitudes is likely to work only in a fairly unsophisticated political system, and any military ruler who seeks to put it into practice in a system where there actually are important political bargaining groups is likely to find himself in trouble. One classic and tragic example is that of the first Nigerian military government of Major General Ironsi between January and July 1966, brought to power as the incidental byproduct of an aborted coup in which he was not directly involved. He identified the country's principal problems, with some justice, as regional and tribal division, and set out to deal with it through central government actions, such as the Unification Decree, which abolished regional civil services, the effect of which was to intensify the insecurity of regional and ethnic groups which readily suspected him of acting for the advantage of his own people. Barely 6 months after coming to power, he was assassinated in a regionally inspired counter-coup, which led to the ethnic killings in the army and the country as a whole, and set Nigeria well on the way to the civil war, which broke out a year later. Few military leaders are quite so naive. Those who remain in power for any length of time have perforce to adapt themselves to the realities of political life, and many do so with considerable skill. The senior officers of forces with well-established traditions of political intervention, such as those of Thailand or Argentina, readily develop into a sophisticated group of soldier politicians whose factional maneuvers are in many ways not qualitatively different from those of the leaders of a civilian political party. They need to look after their supporters, form coalitions, decide when and whether to enter or leave the government, and decide what policies to support when they are in it. The approach to politics implicit in these attitudes is nonetheless reinforced by the organizational structure of the military and its role as the armed wing of the bureaucratic bourgeoisie. Its hierarchical structure, on the one hand, lends itself to carrying out clearly defined tasks, and on the other is placed under great strain by any form of politicization which encourages the questioning of others from above or the formation of rival ideological groups. The maintenance of organizational cohesion is the single most important dilemma facing military governments. Its role as an agency of the state leads the military almost invariably to adopt a managerial approach to political problems. It is an attitude, for example, which lends itself easily to a monetarist approach to economic policy, and even in markedly left-wing regimes. It leads to a socialism of state intervention rather than one of popular participation. What is interesting is the way in which essentially the same attitude and interests led the military at different stages of social and political mobilization into stances which can be classed at opposite ends of the left-right ideological spectrum. In this respect, Hortense's encapsulation of the ideological position of the military is unsurpassed. As society changes, so does the role of the military. In the world of oligarchy, the soldier is a radical. In the middle-class world, he is a participant and arbiter. As the mass society looms on the horizon, he becomes the conservative guardian of the existing order. Thus, the more backward the society is, the more progressive the role of its military. The more advanced a society becomes, the more conservative and reactionary becomes the role of its military. Any government is vulnerable at times of economic crisis, or when its popularity is low for any other reason, especially if it has offended the interests of the bureaucratic elite. A government which, like that in Nigeria in January 1966, has clearly proved incapable of maintaining political order is ripe for overthrow by one that feels it can do better. Corruption and dictatorship, almost invariably given as justification for intervention, may sometimes actually serve as reasons for it. A government of one ethnic complexion may be overthrown by soldiers of another, or still, more simply, an officer such as Amin in Uganda in 1971, or Achimpong in Ghana the following year, may seize power because he wants it for essentially personal reasons. The veto coup takes place when social mobilization has reached a stage which presents a real threat to the interests of bureaucracy and more generally to the interests of the middle classes, which by this stage are likely to have become well developed and firmly entrenched. What it vetoes is mass participation, especially through left-wing parties with policies of drastic social change. It is thus inherently conservative and is likely to seek the support of the United States against opposition, which is correspondingly likely to be backed by the Soviet Union or by its regional allies such as Cuba or Vietnam. One distinctive feature of a veto regime is that since it faces large-scale and broadly based opposition, it will need to take appropriately repressive action if it is to impose itself successfully. A breakthrough coup, by contrast, only needs to dispose of a fairly small governing clique, though it may not do so in a brutal manner. While Guardian coup can frequently, though by no means always, take place without any bloodshed at all, the degree of repression required by the military regimes in Chile after 1973 and Argentina after 1976 helps to confirm the validity of the veto coup as a device intended to restrain popular participation. These types of coup are useful as general indicators of the social basis and political orientations of military regimes, not as hard and fast categories. Guardian regimes especially are subject to a wide range of variation which may affect their political stance, whereas breakthrough coups are almost always the work of junior officers and veto coups of senior ones. Guardian coups can come from any level in the military hierarchy, from generals down through the officers' corps to non-commissioned officers and even private soldiers. Rank also influences military regimes through the pronounced tendency of military hierarchies to fall into generalization sets, in which age grades, which correspond with rank as each set moves up the ladder of promotion, are differentiated by their origins, training, or institutional experience. Those recruited under one regime may have been selected by different criteria from those recruited under another. Pre-war, wartime, and post-war offers may have had markedly different formative experiences. Generational differences are then reinforced by the tendency of soldiers to consult socially and politically with their own peer group. In contrast to the formalized hierarchy of operational command, these differences are particularly marked in ex-colonial armies, though certainly not confined to them. The first generation and indigenous officers in what were to become the armies of the newly independent African states were selected by the colonial rulers from among the senior NCOs. This being the highest rank that any African had been able to reach, men of the long army service, literary education, and limited political outlook, they often proved inadequate to the task of running a modern state, as in their different ways did Ankara of Ghana, Ironsi of Nigeria, and Amin of Uganda, a later generation still under colonial rule, were recruited from the better qualified school leavers or sometimes even university graduates and sent to metropolitan training establishments, followed by direct entry into the officers' corps. A self-conscious elite rapidly promoted as the officer corps was Africanized in the last years of colonialism and early years of independence. This group most often showed the attitude which had led some officers to view the military as an inherently neo-colonial institution. Afrifa in Ghana, who rose from brigade major to head of state over the 3 years from 1966 to 1969, put his administration for colonial institution with embarrassing candor. I was thrilled by Sandhurst, the best part of my life, learning to be a soldier in a wonderful and mysterious institution with traditions going back to 1802. Officers recruited after independence were less likely to be sent to colonial training institutions and often found promotion blocked by a senior generation only a few years older than themselves. Since the armed forces provided the main channel through which the post-independent generation reached positions of political leadership, they sometimes found themselves like Murtala Mohammed in Nigeria or Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, the spokesman for resentment at continued independence, which were widely spread through the whole society. A further source of generational cleavage may arise from changes in the ethnic balance of the army. British colonial armies were famed for their recruitment of soldiers from martial races, generally peoples living away from and hostile to the main centers of education and social change in which opposition to the colonial regime was greatest. Officers recruited just before independence were likely, in contrast, to come from areas in which education was most widespread. In either case, people from the most prosperous areas were least likely to join the army. Post-independence governments sometimes deliberately introduced ethnic criteria for officer recruitment, either to ensure that the army reflected the balance of people in the country as a whole, or more crudely to bias it in favor of the group, which provided its own political base. Once these differences are turned to direct political relevance by the advent of a military regime, the result can be extremely explosive, as most obviously in the Nigerian coup of July 1966 and the Civil War of 1967 to 1970. As a military regime settles down, moreover, it finds itself confronting the same intractable problems as its predecessors, dealing with the same political groups and forces, shoveling the same limited policy options. It is the way in which it interacts with these political forces that chiefly determines whether it remains a specifically military government or metamorphoses itself into something rather different and more broadly based, and that determines indeed whether it remains in power or goes the way of the regime it overthrew. Study session summary. In this study session, we explain some basic reasons for the salience of the military during the Third World politics, which are the centrality of the state actions by the incumbent government, which threatens the interests of the bureaucracy, and justification by reference to more general political goals or ideals, such as incapacity, dishonesty, or ethnic favoritism of the regime. End of study session 3. Thank you for listening.